Beneath endless skies, across frozen forests and boundless steppes, Russia stretches farther than most could ever imagine. Rivers carve through wilderness, distances swallow armies, and the land itself tests those who would rule it. From this vast expanse emerged a power forged by ambition and authority, a state so immense it would eventually span 11 time zones. Moscow rose from scattered principalities to unite distant lands under the authority of the Tsars. Armies marched across continents, merchants linked remote provinces by river and road, and rulers shaped the laws and faith of millions. Expansion was relentless, transforming fragmented territories into a continental superpower. This is the story of a nation born in struggle, forged in conquest, and grown into one of history's greatest empires. A power whose reach shaped continents and whose legacy still echoes today. Long before the Tsars, the lands that would become Russia were a vast tapestry of forests, rivers, and scattered principalities. The early federation, known as Kievan Rus, formed along the great waterways of Eastern Europe, where trade routes connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. Merchants, warriors, and travelers moved along these rivers, exchanging goods, ideas, and beliefs that would shape the region's identity for centuries. From Constantinople came Orthodox Christianity, bringing with it not only religion, but also architecture, art, literacy, and governance. The culture of the Rus blended Norse, Slavic, and Byzantine influences into something unique, an early foundation of Russian civilization. Yet the unity of these lands was fragile, and competing princes struggled for dominance over the growing cities and trade networks. In the 13th century, the Mongol invasions swept across the region like a storm. Cities burned, populations were scattered, and the once powerful federation collapsed into submission beneath the Mongol Golden Horde. For generations, Russian princes ruled as tributaries, collecting taxes for distant khans while their people endured the realities of foreign domination. Yet this period of subjugation also reshaped Russian governance. Princes learned the value of centralized authority, efficient taxation, and military discipline. Among these rulers, the princes of Moscow gradually gained prominence, using diplomacy, alliances, and strategic loyalty to expand their influence over neighboring territories. By the late 15th century, Moscow had become the center of a new power. Under determined leadership, it challenged Mongol authority and began to unite surrounding principalities. What had once been a fractured landscape of rival states was slowly transforming into a single political force, one that would soon begin its journey toward empire. Ivan III's growing state passed to his successors, who continued consolidating authority. By the time Ivan IV took the throne in the mid-16th century, the ruler of Moscow adopted a new title, Tsar. It was a word that carried immense weight, derived from Caesar itself, signaling imperial ambition and absolute authority. Ivan IV, later remembered as Ivan the Terrible, expanded the realm dramatically. His armies captured the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, opening the Volga River and pushing Russian influence deep into territories once ruled by Mongol successors. At the same time, explorers and Cossack adventurers began pushing eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Siberia was vast, cold, and largely unknown to Europeans, yet its rivers offered pathways into endless wilderness. Forts and trading posts appeared along these routes as Russian explorers followed the lure of fur, land, and imperial ambition. Within decades, Russian expansion stretched thousands of miles across Asia. Yet the growing state remained fragile. Ivan IV's reign ended in turmoil. When his dynasty collapsed in the late 16th century, Russia fell into a period of chaos that nearly destroyed the state entirely. When Ivan IV died, the powerful state he had built quickly began to weaken. His son ruled briefly, but when he died without an heir, the ancient ruling line of Russia ended. For the first time in centuries, the country had no clear ruler. A nobleman, Boris Godunov, took the throne, but his reign was struck by catastrophe. Between 1601 and 1603, famine devastated the country as harvests failed and millions starved. As suffering spread, rumors and unrest followed. Soon, a pretender appeared claiming to be the lost son of Ivan the Terrible. Supported by foreign allies and rebellious nobles, he marched into Russia and briefly seized the throne. But his rule collapsed just as quickly, and rival claimants soon plunged the country into chaos. Civil war spread across the land while foreign powers intervened. Polish forces eventually occupied Moscow itself, and for several years Russia nearly ceased to exist as a unified state. The crisis finally ended when a volunteer army led by Kuzma Minin and Prince Dmitry Pozharsky drove the invaders from Moscow in 1612. Soon after, a new ruler was chosen, Michael I of Russia, the first Tsar of the Romanov dynasty. From the brink of collapse, Russia began to rebuild, stronger, more unified, and destined to expand once again. When the early Romanovs were in power, their priority was not expansion, but restoration. Authority had to be rebuilt piece by piece. Local officials were re-established, trade routes reopened, and the influence of the central government slowly extended outward from Moscow once again. Over time, the scars of famine and war began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of order. As stability returned, so did ambition. Beyond the Ural Mountains lay Siberia, a vast and largely unexplored world of forests, rivers, and frozen wilderness. Cossack explorers, merchants, and soldiers pushed steadily eastward, driven by opportunity and supported by the state. They followed river systems deep into the interior, building forts, collecting tribute, and establishing settlements across immense distances. This expansion unfolded over decades, not as a single conquest, but as a slow, relentless movement across Asia. By the late 17th century, Russian influence had reached the Pacific Ocean. What had once been a fractured state struggling to survive was becoming something far larger, a continental power. Yet, despite its immense size, Russia remained isolated from the political and technological developments shaping Western Europe. It was powerful, but not yet modern. That would change under a new ruler, Peter I of Russia, often revered as the Great. Determined to transform his country, Peter traveled across Europe, working in shipyards, observing armies, and studying the systems that made European states powerful. He returned not just with knowledge, but with a vision to remake Russia entirely. Reform came rapidly and often brutally. The army was reorganized into a modern fighting force, trained along European lines. A navy was built from nothing, giving Russia a presence at sea. Industries were established, and the government was restructured to better manage the empire's immense territory. Peter did not stop at institutions. He sought to reshape society itself. Nobles were required to serve the state, old traditions were challenged, and Western customs were introduced at court. His changes were sweeping, often resisted, but impossible to ignore. Russia was being forced into a new identity. Yet reform alone was not enough. To secure its future, Russia needed access to the wider world. This led to the Great Northern War, a long and costly struggle against Sweden for control of the Baltic region. Across years of conflict, Russian forces endured defeat, adapted, and ultimately prevailed. Victory brought more than land, it brought transformation. With access to the Baltic Sea secured, Peter founded a new capital, St. Petersburg, built on marshland at immense human cost. Facing westward, the city symbolized Russia's shift from isolation to engagement with Europe. By the end of his reign, Russia had been fundamentally changed. The state that had once stood on the brink of collapse had been reshaped into a rising empire, modernizing, expanding, and ready to play a decisive role in the balance of power across Europe and Asia. In the years after the death of Peter I of Russia, the empire he had reshaped continued to grow in strength and confidence. Russia was no longer a distant power. It had entered the center of European affairs, its armies and influence now impossible to ignore. This was made clear during the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that drew in the great powers of the world. Russian forces marched deep into Central Europe, even occupying Berlin for a time. Though the war ended without lasting gains for Russia, it demonstrated something far more important. The empire had become a decisive military force on the European stage. That rising power would reach its height under Catherine the Great. Seizing the throne in 1762, Catherine inherited an empire already transformed, but she would push it further than ever before. Through calculated diplomacy and military strength, she expanded Russian influence in every direction. To the south, victories against the Ottoman Empire brought access to the Black Sea and the annexation of Crimea, securing a long-sought strategic advantage. To the west, Russia reshaped the map of Eastern Europe. Through the partitions of Poland, vast territories were absorbed into the empire, bringing millions under Russian rule and extending its reach deeper into the continent than ever before. Under Catherine, Russia was no longer simply rising, it was dominating. Her reign also brought a cultural shift. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals, she supported education, corresponded with European thinkers, and sought to present Russia as both powerful and sophisticated. Yet beneath this progress, tensions remained. Serfdom continued to bind millions, and uprisings like the rebellion of Yemelyan Pugachev revealed the fragile balance between authority and unrest. Even at its peak, the empire carried the weight of its own size and contradictions. Still, by the end of Catherine's rule, Russia stood as one of the great powers of Europe, an empire vast in territory, formidable in strength, and deeply embedded in the politics of the continent. And as a new century approached, that power would soon face a challenge unlike any it had known before. Her son, Paul I of Russia, inherited the throne, and with it an empire he neither trusted nor fully controlled. Paul ruled with suspicion and intensity, reversing many of his mother's policies and imposing strict discipline on both the military and the nobility. His reign was marked by abrupt decisions, rigid authority, and growing paranoia. Nobles who had flourished under Catherine now found themselves constrained, watched, and increasingly dissatisfied. In 1801, Paul was assassinated in a palace coup, a stark reminder that even at its height, imperial power in Russia could be fragile. His son would take the throne, and with him, Russia would face one of the greatest challenges in its history. In the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte rose to dominate Europe through conquest. One by one, major powers fell or submitted, until Russia, under Alexander I of Russia, stood in opposition. In 1812, Napoleon invaded with one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. But from the Russian perspective, this would not be a war of quick victory. It would be a war of endurance. Under the authority of the Tsar, Russian forces withdrew deeper into the empire, abandoning cities and destroying supplies. Distance and scarcity became weapons, stretching the French army to its limits. When Napoleon reached Moscow, he found it nearly empty, and soon after, burning. The loss was severe, but it denied the invaders shelter and resources. With winter closing in and no victory secured, the French retreat turned into disaster. Cold, hunger, and constant attacks shattered the army as it fled westward. Russia had endured and broken the greatest military force in Europe. Under Alexander I of Russia, Russian forces pushed forward, joining the Soyuz that would defeat Napoleon. By 1814, they marched into Paris itself. The empire had proven its strength, but the war also revealed something deeper. Russia's vastness had saved it, but the same scale and system that ensured survival would soon begin to test its future. The victory over Napoleon Bonaparte left Russia powerful, but also changed. Officers and soldiers who had marched across Europe returned with new ideas about reform, representation, and limits to absolute rule. When Nicholas I of Russia came to power in 1825, those ideas erupted almost immediately. A group of army officers launched what became known as the Decembrist Uprising, demanding constitutional reform. It was crushed. Nicholas saw the rebellion not as an isolated event, but as a warning. From that moment on, his rule would be defined by control. He strengthened the autocracy, expanded secret police networks, and imposed strict censorship across the empire. Order became the priority, and dissent was treated as a threat to the state itself. His guiding principle was simple: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, a system meant to unify the empire under faith, absolute rule, and Russian identity. For a time, it worked. Russia remained stable and powerful, projecting influence across Europe and maintaining its vast territorial control. But beneath that enforced order, deeper problems continued to grow. Industrial progress lagged behind other European powers, and the system of serfdom still bound millions to the land. By suppressing change, Nicholas preserved the empire, but he also prevented it from adapting. That weakness became clear during the Crimean War. Facing a coalition of European powers, Russia struggled to compete with more modern armies and technologies. The defeat exposed the limits of a system built on control rather than reform. The empire still stood strong on the surface, but beneath it, pressure was building, slowly, steadily, and inevitably. The rigid order imposed under Nicholas I of Russia preserved the empire, but it also left it unprepared for change. By the time of his death in 1855, Russia remained vast and powerful, yet increasingly outmatched by the modernizing powers of Europe. His successor, Alexander II of Russia, recognized the danger. The defeat in the Crimean War had exposed the empire's weaknesses, and reform could no longer be delayed. In 1861, he took a historic step, emancipating the serfs. Millions were freed from centuries of bondage, and for a moment, it seemed Russia might finally begin to transform. Courts were reformed, local governments established, and cautious modernization began to take shape. But reform came unevenly. Freed peasants often remained burdened by debt and poor land, while nobles resisted losing their authority. Instead of resolving tensions, change revealed how deep the problems truly ran. New ideas spread, and revolutionary movements began to take root. In 1881, that tension reached its breaking point. Alexander II was assassinated in the streets of St. Petersburg. the very ruler who had tried to reform the empire, brought down by those who believed he had not gone far enough. His death marked a sudden reversal. His son, Alexander III of Russia, took the throne with a very different vision. Where his father had pursued reform, he chose control. Determined to prevent further instability, he strengthened autocratic rule, expanded secret police powers, and reversed many of the liberalizing efforts of the previous era. Russification policies were enforced across the empire, seeking to unify its many peoples under a single identity, often through pressure and coercion. Dissent was suppressed, and revolutionary movements were driven underground rather than eliminated. For a time, order returned. Industry began to grow, railways expanded, and the empire appeared stable once more. But beneath the surface, the same tensions remained: social inequality, political repression, and a growing divide between the state and its people. Russia had tried reform. It had turned back to control. But neither path had solved the deeper problems. And as a new century approached, those unresolved tensions were beginning to gather once again. By the time Nicholas II of Russia took the throne in 1894, the Russian Empire remained vast and powerful. But beneath the surface, it was deeply unstable. Decades of reform and repression had failed to resolve the empire's core tensions. Industrial growth had transformed cities, but also created overcrowding, poor working conditions, and rising anger among workers. Nicholas II believed firmly in autocracy. Like his predecessors, he resisted meaningful political reform, convinced that absolute rule was essential to preserving the empire. But the Russia he ruled was no longer the Russia of earlier centuries. New ideas, socialism, nationalism, and revolution were spreading faster than the state could contain. The first major shock came in 1905. After a humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, unrest erupted across the empire. Workers marched in protest, demanding reform, only to be met with violence in what became known as Bloody Sunday. Strikes, uprisings, and mutinies followed, forcing Nicholas to make concessions. For the first time, a representative assembly, the Duma, was created. But real power remained with the Tsar. Reforms were limited, and as order was gradually restored, many of the promises made in 1905 were rolled back or weakened. The underlying tensions remained unresolved, waiting for another crisis. That crisis came with the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Russia entered the war with massive armies, but poor coordination, weak infrastructure, and outdated leadership quickly took their toll. Defeats mounted. Supplies ran short. Millions of soldiers were killed or wounded, while conditions at home deteriorated rapidly. Nicholas II took personal command of the army, tying his fate directly to the war's failures. Meanwhile, in the capital, political instability deepened. The influence of figures like Grigory Rasputin further eroded public confidence in the monarchy. Food shortages, inflation, and exhaustion pushed the population to the breaking point. In 1917, the empire finally gave way. Mass protests erupted in Petrograd. Workers went on strike. Soldiers refused to fire on civilians and instead joined them. The authority of the state collapsed in a matter of days. Nicholas II abdicated the throne. 3 centuries of Romanov rule came to an end. But removing the Tsar did not solve Russia's problems. It exposed them. A provisional government took power, promising reform and a new political future. Yet it made one critical decision: to continue fighting in World War I. The war dragged on, casualties mounted, and conditions worsened. At the same time, a second center of power emerged. Workers' councils, or Soviets, made up of soldiers and laborers who demanded immediate change. Between the government and the Soviets, authority was divided, unstable, and constantly challenged. Into this chaos stepped a new force. Led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread, an end to war, redistribution of land, and relief for the struggling population. Their message spread rapidly among those who had lost faith in gradual reform. By the end of the year, the situation reached its breaking point. In the October Revolution, Bolshevik forces moved quickly to seize control of key locations in Petrograd. The provisional government was overthrown with little resistance, and power shifted into the hands of the revolutionaries. The old system did not fall with a single blow. It collapsed in stages, each failure deepening the next. What began as protest became revolution. What began as reform became overthrow. And what began as the fall of a monarchy became the birth of an entirely new political order. The Russian Empire was gone, replaced by a revolutionary state that would reshape the course of the 20th century. Long before it became an empire, Russia was a collection of scattered lands, rivers binding distant settlements, forests separating fragile centers of power. From Kievan Rus to the rise of Moscow, its story was never inevitable. It was built slowly through conflict, survival, and the steady gathering of land and people. It did not rise all at once. It expanded in generations, one ruler securing borders, another pushing them further. From the election of Michael I of Russia to the reign of Peter the Great, the foundations were laid, not just of power, but of identity. An empire shaped as much by distance as by ambition. By the time of Catherine the Great, that growth had become dominance. Russia was no longer forming, it had arrived. A power stretching across continents, influencing the fate of Europe and defining itself not just by what it controlled, but by the scale at which it existed. And yet, through every stage of its rise, one thing remained constant: the need to hold it all together. Across centuries, across rulers, across wars and reforms, the story of Russia was never just expansion. It was endurance. The ability to gather, to adapt, and to continue forward, even as the weight of that vastness grew with each generation. Empires are remembered for their size, but they are built through time. And even as this one reached its end, the forces that shaped it did not disappear. The land remained. The scale endured. And the same drive to control, to unify, to shape the world beyond its borders was already beginning to take form once again.